Hello, everyone. Welcome back for our next speaker at Write the Docs 2024 here. We have Tom Edmonds. Tom is a technical writer by way of support, coming into the position by taking initiative with the limited documentation and rising to the occasion, as we all do. He's got interests in wheels and cheese, and yes, that does include wheels of cheese. If he's got an opportunity to take a dip into a pool, it's going to be an infinity pool. Welcome to his talk, The Vibes Are Off, Adapting Agile Story Points Estimation to Technical Writing. Tom Edmonds, everyone.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by saying that the vibes are definitely not off here in this room. I've always loved the vibe here at Write the Docs, which makes it a little less nerve-wracking for me as a first-time public speaker here on the main stage. So thank you for the vibes. A little bit about me. I live here in Portland. Thank you all for visiting. I hope you're having a great time. I am a senior technical writer at Dutchie. Dutchie is an e-commerce and point-of-sale platform for the cannabis industry. So if you partake and you are inclined to visit one of our many friendly dispensaries while you're here in town in Portland, or anywhere where cannabis is legal, you can peruse a dispensary's selection and place an order on Dutchie.com. And there's a good chance that your purchase will be rung up on Dutchie's point-of-sale system. At Dutchie, my team and I are responsible for maintaining our client-facing help center as well as an internal knowledge base. And in my 6-ish years as a tech writer, I've had some wonderful mentors. You know who you are. And I've learned a lot by trying new things, leaving my comfort zone, and faking it till I make it, all of which are very relevant to this talk. This talk, by the way, is the story of a still ongoing experiment. For a little over a year, through trial and error, I've been experimenting with developing useful quantitative metrics for the 3-person team of technical writers that I'm a part of. This talk is more of a status report than any conclusion. By sharing my experience thus far and by giving a few recommendations, my hope is to encourage others to lean into a topic that I think most of us tend to avoid. So let's talk about metrics for tech writing. Conversations about performance, productivity, and success metrics used to make me feel like this. I'm guessing many of you can relate. The fact is, technical writing is hard to measure. After all, our work is about storytelling, and stats like word counts or time spent don't really tell the full story of everything that goes into producing or maintaining effective documentation. As such, many of us are inclined to instead use our well-honed storytelling skills to explain to our leadership and other stakeholders why traditional metrics just won't work for tech writing teams, and that our experienced and informed but ultimately subjective assessments will just have to suffice. Which is to say, tech writing and writing in general resists meaningful quantification. We just kind of know through some inscrutable sixth sense that one task is a lot more work than another seemingly similar task. Or at least we think we know. In other words, it's just kind of a vibe. I mean, what do I mean by a vibe, though? Well, for example, sometimes it seems like a simple maintenance task at first, where a button has been relabeled and moved. Easy fix, right? But then you scratch the surface, and it's actually much more in-depth and time-consuming than you might have thought. And the reality is that button is mentioned in 25 articles and appears in 10 screenshots, and you don't have the tooling that allows us to change all that in bulk. Sometimes it goes the other way, where we're completely redesigning one of the most used areas of the product. But then that seemingly Herculean task ends up being no big deal, because the reality is you're working with a lovely product manager who's already done the heavy lifting. The new UI is so much more intuitive. Shout out to product managers and UX designers. Other times, your initial vibe is exactly correct, because sometimes we've never documented all of our permissions, and all the oral history and knowledge you need to do that is long gone. But like a broken clock, just because your initial vibe is occasionally spot on, that doesn't mean you should rely on vibes all the time. See, the problem with vibes-based estimation is that you are relying largely on your subjective perception, which can be inconsistent and unreliable. And not taking any steps to move beyond that vibes-based, gut feeling sort of approach deprives us of any real data to help us understand and demonstrate to others our workload or team capacity. Okay, fine, so we need to come up with some actual quantitative metrics. Now, at the beginning of this experiment, no one was necessarily breathing down our necks or putting pressure on my team to quantify our work or start applying any particular set of metrics. But we did have a general sense that the vibes-based approach wasn't going to be sustainable. And I wanted to preempt any potential future reckoning that might involve having unworkable metrics foisted upon us. So, proactively showing a willingness to at least experiment with quantitative metrics on our own terms seemed like a pretty worthy endeavor. But if not vibes, then what? Well, time tracking is tedious and can be really impractical. How am I supposed to allocate time spent in a weekly go-to-market meeting where I get rapid-fire updates on 6 different projects? Not only that, but time is not created equal. 30 minutes of writing brand new documentation, 30 minutes of in-depth research, or 30 minutes of simple maintenance tasks all represent different levels of cognitive load and energy demand. Time tracking doesn't help us illustrate effort or level of difficulty. Number of tickets completed presents similar issues. Tickets, too, are not created equal. One might be something as simple as removing some outdated info. Another might be an end-to-end user guide for an entirely new product or feature set. Well, what about word counts? Well, for starters, aiming for a higher word count is counterintuitive and counterproductive when our goal is to be concise. This sets up the wrong incentive for tech writers. Plus, our work is so much more than just writing. We also need to account for the time and effort spent gathering and validating all the information that went into it, and for occasional rework and when the design, functionality, or scope of a feature changes. So thinking about how all these metrics are terrible led me to, well, what if we tried using an adapted form of story points? Okay, so definitions time. Story points are units of measure for expressing an estimate of the overall effort required to fully implement a piece of work. And I think fully is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. Teams assign story points relative to work complexity, the amount of work, and risk or uncertainty. So for our purposes, story points are a holistic numerical scoring system where a lower score equals a lower overall effort. And the concept of story points is one that I'm borrowing from Agile software development methodologies, and I'm using Atlassian's definition here because all of our work is tracked in Jira, which for anyone unfamiliar is an Atlassian product and a common tool for tracking tasks and projects, i.e. Jira tickets. Jira tickets are what we are assigning points to. Here's a fake example of a Jira ticket. Anyone in the company can and is encouraged to submit tickets to us in Jira to request updates or new documentation. Tickets can also come to us whenever a product manager writes up a ticket for any customer-facing change in the product. And we also sometimes create tickets for ourselves to track any necessary tasks that we've identified. So the goals of this story point experiment that we took on were that we, first of all, wanted to measure our team's workload and capacity in a quantitative, holistic, and systematic way. We wanted to increase transparency about our processes, prioritization, and decision-making for our stakeholders, and also illustrate the level of detail that we're looking for in those submissions. Another possible bonus that I haven't really officially identified here as a goal is the fact that better inputs result in better outputs. So if we can increase the thoroughness and detail of the requests we get, the resulting documentation will probably be better. And we want to reduce subjectivity and inconsistency in our estimations. Because each team member is self-scoring their own work, I won't pretend that we're completely eliminating subjectivity here. Nor would I necessarily argue that there's no place for subjective judgments or experience-based inferences in this process. But we can reduce subjectivity by using a consistent framework tailored to our own purposes, which is definitely less subjective than vibes alone. Looking back, I think articulating non-goals was just as important as the goals. This helped me focus my attention as I was slicing and dicing a pretty expansive data set. Our non-goals for this experiment were, We're not adapting Agile software methodology in general. We're not working in sprints, which are specific timeframes where you would plan to complete a specific amount of work, or adapting our overall processes to Agile methodologies. We're just borrowing the concept of story points from developers and tweaking it in ways that make sense for our team and our work. We are not seeking to measure performance either as individual contributors or as a team. Story points are more of a planning tool, and I definitely wanted to avoid inadvertently creating any perception that some team members are more productive or higher performing than others. We are not tracking time or setting timelines based on a given ticket score, and we're not setting any expectation based on the score of when that ticket's going to be completed. And we're not seeking to measure the effectiveness or quality of documentation. That's a very hot topic that others can speak on much more authoritatively than I can. We're just measuring the work that goes into it at the beginning. So how do we actually implement all of this? Well, with our goals and non-goals articulated, we got to work adapting the concept of story points to fit our purposes. We arrive at our scores by going through a multi-point scoring rubric based on tech writing specific factors that we identified as a team. We also score each ticket twice. The conventional use of story points focuses on estimation before work begins, typically when planning a sprint. That would be our initial score. But we're not working in sprints yet, necessarily, and our goal is to go beyond just estimation and planning. We also want to measure our current workload and our historical capacity, and gauge how accurate our estimates turned out to be with the benefit of hindsight. So that would be our final score. Then we started developing our scoring rubric. And let me tell you, this was my favorite part of the whole project because writing down and weighing all the relative importance of all the different factors that affects our creative process and either makes our jobs easier or harder was unexpectedly cathartic. That catharsis continued when I reviewed my draft rubric with my teammates and got their feedback. Commiserating with each other about these factors was kind of like a team-building activity. After I addressed the team feedback, I went through a calibration exercise. So I've heard this called planning poker among developers. For us, I felt like it was more like tech writing moot court, where we identified several of our own past tickets that represented varying levels of effort, silently assigned our own scores, and then revealed our own scores to each other and explained our reasoning where we had differences. That led to a deeper dive on any tickets where the scores diverged significantly. So we then further modified and clarified our rubric, with the goal being to make sure that we all had the same understanding of our criteria and could consistently apply them to different types of tickets. So here's the current iteration of our scoring rubric. And you may notice that we incorporated some of those metrics I talked about earlier that we considered inadequate by themselves. That doesn't mean they don't play some role in our evaluation. For instance, the first question is designed to quickly identify those relatively simple tasks that are mostly just a matter of how long will this take, and represent low cognitive load. So think correcting typos, removing some outdated information, adding a quick blurb with some helpful context, editing some copy that somebody gave to us, etc. So for these, we assign half a point to 2 points based on how long we think it'll take us, and skip the rest of the rubric. Next, does the request give me enough information to at least get started? Or will my first step be going back to the submitter to get clarification about what they're expecting us to do? So that's a half point right there. We then want to know who our subject matter expert or SME is. Often it could be the submitter themselves, or sometimes the submitter will mention another person who can answer questions or provide more detail. Sometimes it's a matter of, no one knows how this works, and a customer is demanding an explanation from me, and I don't know what to do, so can you please figure it out for me? But if I have to hunt around just to find out who knows anything about the thing, that's half a point to 1 point. Then there's our old friend word count. We were assigned 1 to 3 points based on our estimate of how much actual writing the ticket will require, and also allow a half point for tasks that involve editing provided copy but don't really fit into that is it just a simple task criterion from earlier. Next, research. I found this is fairly rare, and we're not really doing a ton of our own research on my team, but we do sometimes have to do some digging. So we thus have a somewhat subjective allowance of up to 4 points here, with half a point for when it's really hard to predict how much research we'll end up doing. Adding visual aids can tack on up to 2.5 points. For my team, this is usually just screenshots, because we also have fabulous trainers and instructional designers on our staff who come up with some great videos and other visuals. But if my team was routinely creating videos or other graphics on top of tech writing, I would have allowed a much higher maximum here. Will this affect multiple docs? Actually, updating all those docs is usually the easy part. Identifying all the places that that thing is mentioned that need to be updated can be quite an undertaking, especially if you don't have the tooling to facilitate finding and changing all of that in bulk. And finally, because we can't necessarily predict or account for every conceivable factor, and in recognition that there is still some value in our subjective judgments based on our experience, we can assign up to 4 additional points for those intangibles, uncertainties, and unusual circumstances. This whole rubric is, of course, specific to my team and our purposes and our pain points. So yours, if you take on a similar experiment, might have different factors, or you might weigh factors differently. The point is, you get to design it yourself. Now, as long as we're going to all the trouble of scoring every ticket, it makes sense to see what we can measure, what else we can measure, or what other insights we can spot by categorizing tickets based on the type of work. These are the categories that we use, but I encourage you to think about what sorts of categories would make sense for your team and your organization. Product release, typically pretty easy, tickets related to new features or other product updates. We have a category for tasks with a regulatory compliance or market-specific component. This is an especially important category for the legal cannabis industry, and documentation in this category tends to be challenging and high stakes. Furthermore, Dutchy operates in every US state where cannabis is legal, as well as Canada, so each legal market has its own nuances. Documentation debt deals with existing, not new functionality that we just never properly or fully documented. Maintenance tasks are associated with upkeep of the help center itself, the information architecture, style and formatting, etc. These are all non-substantive changes that aren't directly related to the product. And backlog, which I should probably rename, is just a catch-all for everything else that doesn't necessarily fit into one of those other categories. Finally, I gathered data by just adding a custom number field to our JIRA tickets where we could record those initial and final scores. Side note, if you do take on a similar experiment, make sure this is a number field and not text. Or I had it as a multi-select drop-down, which just was a huge waste of time. It didn't work with any of the widgets I wanted to make on my dashboard. Yeah, just keep it simple. From there, I built filters in JIRA based on tickets submitted and tickets completed by category. And then I used the JIRA Cloud for Sheets plugin to just import all those filter results into Google Sheets, where I could start crunching the numbers. The details are a bit too tedious for this talk, but I'm happy to talk more about any of this with anyone who'd like to know. Some of the key stats I uncovered, or that I specifically wanted to look at, were average and total scores by category, which gives us an idea of the relative complexity by those categories and what percentage of our workload goes into each category. I'm looking to do the same with product components, meaning like areas of the product itself in the future. More on that later. To get an idea of our realistic capacity, I looked at our average points completed by week for the whole team and also per writer. Again, to avoid any implication of performance metrics here, I just divided it by number of writers, not by specific team member. I also look at median and mode point values for given time frames, which aren't really that useful on their own, but they do help to spot unusual trends or where I just screwed up in my tabulations. And the average difference between initial and final scores helps us gauge the accuracy of our estimates, I think. More on that later, too. Some of the notable results include we pretty consistently complete 10 to 12 points per week per writer, which gives us a nice baseline to plan around. Across a year's worth of data, the average difference between our initial scores and final scores is just 0.19 points on a 20-point scale, suggesting our estimates are pretty reliable. And the product release category surprisingly accounts for far fewer points than I thought it would, about 25%. Whether this is true or if there's something wrong with my data is something I'm trying to dig into a little bit more. I know the whole point of this talk is to get away from vibes-based thinking, but something about this statistic just doesn't ring true to me. I'm also open to the possibility that my perception is skewed because I also write our release notes, which are currently not scored or factored into the data at all. So product releases take up a disproportionate amount of my brain space, so maybe that's why I'm thinking that it's more than 25%. Maybe I should trust my data. We'll see. But next, let's move on to all the things that I wish I had done differently, or all the mistakes I made so you don't have to. Here's where I hope I can make my greatest impact and contribution by helping you avoid these pitfalls in your own experiments with story points. So first, I overestimated the true range of scores. The rubric, as I said, adds up to 20 possible points, but I found that 66% of tickets were 1 or 2 points, and only 6% were more than 10 points. The highest ever was 17 points. So I think I got kind of caught up in thinking about those absolute worst case scenario nightmare tickets instead of focusing on the vastly more common ones. We did end up adjusting our rubric a bit after finding this result, despite concern about making months worth of data useless by changing the scale mid-experiment. So instead of changing the maximum, I just adjusted the point values for some of the factors to try to mitigate this over-concentration of 1s and 2s. And we decided to start allowing half points. The original rubric was whole points only. If I could do it all over, though, I might have gone with a 10-point scale. As long as we're choosing an arbitrary number, we might as well make it a nice round 10, and assigned half points or maybe even quarter points to some of the criteria. And we could have broken up some larger tasks into multiple tickets and thus multiple scores by instead of stretching out the scale to accommodate like the most effort theoretical ticket imaginable. On that subject, though, I waited way too long to analyze the data and make adjustments to the rubric, 3 entire quarters to be exact. I focused too much on the idea that a bigger sample size will give me better data, and didn't consider the possibility of just gathering a ton of bad data, which is why I recommend digging into your data early on to determine whether you need to refine your rubric, maybe after a month or 2. Sample size is definitely important, but changes midway through are going to create an apples to oranges situation with your historical data. Beware of the sunk costs fallacy, and don't be afraid to just start over. I started the experiment by only scoring tickets created after a certain date. The reason I did that was that I wanted to capture initial scores only before we started the work, never retroactively, so that the initial score would remain a true estimate without any benefit of hindsight. I didn't want to like make up theoretical initial scores here. So I picked a date and decided we're only going to score new tickets created after this date. But that meant all of the work that was already in progress as of that date never got scored at all. So the overall points for that first quarter of my data are artificially way low. I could have maintained the integrity of that initial score without sacrificing useful final score data on all of those tickets. So if I could do it again, I would have skipped the initial score on those initial in-progress tickets, still given them a final score and just excluded them from the analysis of initial versus final scores. Which brings me to the significance of the difference between initial and final scores is unclear because it kind of measures 2 different things. If there are significant differences between final and initial scores, does that call into question the accuracy of our estimates? Or could it just mean that the scope of some tickets changed mid-project and they ended up being easier or more complex than we could have possibly predicted? I should have avoided muddying this statistic and kept the focus on scoring accuracy, and then come up with a different way of indicating scope changes so that I could evaluate those tickets separately. I initially didn't think about analyzing scores by product component, like I mentioned earlier. At Dutchie, we have 3 distinct products and a long list of product components or sort of subcategories within them. Inventory management, discounts, pricing, user management, third-party integrations, regulatory compliance, etc. So for the first 3 quarters, we only tracked the technical writing categories that I started with, not the product component. Luckily, this already existed in our Jira instance, but I did have to go back and retroactively add it to a bunch of tickets, and I'm still figuring out how to parse that data. I didn't fully consider the definition of done. Or more importantly, how it's represented in our data. Far too late in this process, I discovered that Jira's resolution attribute didn't apply to the way our team's Jira project was set up, which meant there wasn't really a great way to identify when a ticket was actually completed. The best proxy I could come up with for when a ticket was completed ended up being the date that the ticket status last changed, which usually means the date that we moved it into published status. But that also means that if someone accidentally reopens or otherwise changes the status of a finished ticket, its completed date becomes today's date, and we lose the actual date. So I'm like one bad bulk management job away from just completely blowing up my data set. So if I could do it again, I would make sure we had a better, more reliable way to keep track of completion dates. I also didn't solicit feedback from a data specialist, even though we have some on staff at Dutchie. I tried to do this, but then I ran out of time, so this is totally on me. But if you're not an Excel pro and you're not very experienced in data analysis, like me, talk to someone who is. There was probably a better way for me to gather data, and my strategy might have changed if I had asked one of those numbers people for their input. This one is still on the to-do list. Now, it wasn't all mistakes. Some things actually went well. So here's my other advice. I would say invest a lot of thought early on into what those goals and non-goals should be for you. Carefully consider your categories and other variables that you might want to measure or compare with story points, and add those to your tickets from the start, so you're not doing a bunch of retroactive component adding and categorization. Also, I'd say avoid adding multiple categories to a single ticket. Some might reasonably fit into more than one category, but I'd say choose the one that it's closest to. Otherwise, you're counting a single ticket's total score towards multiple categories, or figuring out how to allocate points across components, and it's just a big mess. Don't do it. And since this whole process depends on individual humans remembering to manually enter information on every ticket, build a dashboard for your team and review it regularly. Here's my dashboard, which we review in our bi-weekly planning meetings. It includes, among other things, widgets based on Jira filters that show tickets missing tech writing category, missing product component, tickets with missing scores when they should have them by now, based on their status, and the number of points in progress by team member. But maybe my most important piece of advice is that failure is quite literally not an option as long as you give it a shot and stick with it. The exercise itself will likely provide you some valuable insights, even if you struggle to draw solid conclusions or implement better processes based on your data. Or, at the very least, you'll get out of the habit of vibes-based estimation and planning. And you can also demonstrate to stakeholders and your management that your team is at least willing to explore quantitative metrics instead of just avoiding the conversation altogether. So, the next steps. Did my mic just die? Okay, cool. Next steps for my team include spreading awareness of our scoring system, so we can use story points not as a way to say, nope, we're at capacity, can't take any more work on, that's unrealistic and was never our intention, but instead using it to sort of get to yes by showing stakeholders some low-effort steps they can take to lower their submission score and increase the likelihood that we can prioritize and complete it sooner. Like I said, I still need to figure out how to analyze all that product component data I recently started collecting. Because of some upstream processes beyond our control, a lot of tickets have multiple components. So I need to figure out how to deal with the data duplication issue I alluded to earlier with anything that has multiple components on it. And how do we budget our capacity and connect story points to periods of time? You know, sometimes a ticket, you start it, you finish it in an hour. Sometimes you've got one open for a month or two. You know, how do we figure out, like, this budget is for this week, we're doing this stuff this week, this stuff next week, whatever. Maybe some adapted form of sprints is part of the answer here. maybe instead of looking at 10 to 12 points per week, we start thinking about 40 to 50 points a month or something like that. We'll figure it out. But yeah, there's still a lot to think about here, but now that I'm about to finish this talk, I'll have more capacity to start digging into these questions and next steps. And hopefully, some of you now feel inspired to try your own experiments with story points. So thank you. And keep on vibing, but only in a general sense.
Did I turn the... No, Tom Edmonds, everyone. Thank you so much. And now our Q&A session will begin. Tom, have a seat. There's been quite a lot of enthusiasm for your attire, your shirt. And
oh, yeah.
Check out the Slack channel. The site is there, embedded in a response, so go ahead and purchase that shirt if you'd so like to. And then we'll get started. Yeah, well, the first one, the enthusiasm is there. How did your meme game get so strong?
I don't think it really is. I just spent too much time on it instead of the words part. But
you spent
hey,
the appropriate amount of time.
You paid attention to the memes, so that helps. Honestly, it was just the Google Slides has like a add images and GIFs thing. I just kind of searched there. The Bush mission accomplished one, though. I'm pretty proud of that one.
Yes, you should be. The next question here, loved your talk. Oh yeah, we've got that again at the talk, the shirt highlighted here. Slack, go ahead and check the channel. And next up here, have you thought about allowing writers to not use the additive scoring factor matrix and just say, that's a 3, or this is a 5, based on other experiences?
I mean, I feel like that's kind of the point that we're trying not to do. Well, that first line of the rubric was kind of just like, some of them you look at them, you know, like, this is a 2. This is going to take me an hour, it's going to be done, you know, we can do that. But yeah, I wanted to get away from too much subjectivity here, so. And like at one point I did kind of consider like, it got a little too complicated, but like, you know, some factors could be like a minus point, but I kind of just made it, you know, all additive. It's like either that factor is not present or it is.
Yeah.
We wanted to make it not like super heavy lift for ourselves or make it like incomprehensible to anybody outside of our team. So yeah.
Yeah, and this is a similar question related to that from Brooke here. It sounds like you're using your own point system. Have you considered using the Fibonacci sequence, t-shirt sizing, or other options recommended by Jira?
I am familiar with the Fibonacci sequence in the terms of like, it's like a seashell thing. I don't know, I will plead ignorance here. Maybe we should talk, because maybe you have a better idea than I do.
There's an unconference session on just numbers. Yeah. Just a bunch of numbers there.
We talked about t-shirt sizing, but it felt a little too simple. Like,
yeah,
and like also we wanted to make it numbers, so I could make averages and like do some like basic statistical analysis.
Yeah, and then as a side note for t-shirt sizing, you know, vanity sizing, different brands, different countries. Is
this a Zara large or is this like a Kohl's large?
Right. So here we got another question. What is the benefit of keeping initial and final scores? Is the final score the most important? Yeah, why not just change the score from the estimate?
Well, again, I wanted to kind of gauge, you know, are our initial estimates way off? Like, is this even worth pursuing, or are we pretty close at figuring out like what it's going to turn out to be? It's kind of a prediction thing. But then I also didn't want to rely on just that initial score for, you know, this is what our workload is, because, you know, things can change. A 2 can turn into a 10. So it's kind of a dual purpose there. I mean, the traditional use of story points is just for initial planning, right? But like, I really wanted to like be able to revisit at the end of the work, being like, where did this actually land? Was it actually as easy as we thought it was going to be, or you know, did it snowball into some much bigger task?
And it's great for retro, right? If you're looking back and, you know, we assessed this wrong.
That like 10 to 12 points per week per writer, like that's like the golden statistic for me. And like I wouldn't have been able to base that on initial scores because that was just a guess. I wanted to know like what did the effort level on this each ticket turn out to be?
Awesome. Next question here, possibly about Jira, but how did you build that dashboard?
I think it's just, I mean, you can build a dashboard. It is built in Jira. I didn't do anything fancy. I don't have like a separate, you know, integration or any like add-ons there. It was just a matter of building out the filters. That was really the hard part, because I'm not like a super master at JQL yet, but I have learned a lot in that area. Just, yeah, building filters about like, okay, well, this ticket is in progress, it's in drafting status, which means it should have an initial score, so it's capturing anything that's got a null initial, but it's drafting status, that kind of thing. And like each of those widgets is really just like, I think it's just it's called just filter results in the dashboard maker in Jira. Yeah, I could dig into more of it, but I literally just like Googled like how to make a dashboard in Jira.
It can be really challenging. I've been in that situation before, and starting from scratch with the Jira dashboard is rough, to say the least.
Atlassian has great documentation of their own and the great community around it too. So it's, you can pretty easily search around it. It might take you a while to find the subject you're looking for, but somebody has done what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Start, and then it'll come to you.
Exactly.
Here, a question about estimating the time. How much time per week does your team spend in this planning?
The planning meeting itself is, I think we're going to shorten it actually to half an hour. I think we've been doing an hour. I honestly don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look at my calendar again. But I mean, we don't score them together. That's another thing that I've thought about doing. Like in that meeting, we go through together and actually score them together. What we do is we assign them, and then whatever's in your triage, like once you pick one out, you say, okay, this is what I think the initial score is. So yeah, our processes are still kind of evolving, but as of now, it's literally just whenever I start working on it, I score, I put in the initial, and then when I finish it, I put in the final.
Excellent. Here, do you have a strategy for breaking up projects into smaller projects if they've got too large of a score or something similar?
Not really, because again, I thought like we would have a lot more of these just like monster 20-pointer tickets, and like what we found was, I mean, yeah, my vibe was off. Like I thought like, so many of our tickets are so hard, and then I realized like actually most of them are like fairly simple once we dig into it. So yeah, the really big ones haven't really come up, and if there is like a really big one, it's usually not like, somebody just submitted the permissions thing actually is very common. Like we get that about every quarter of like, I don't know what permissions do. It's like, join the club. But if those really big projects, those are usually something that's kind of like driven by leadership or like overall company strategy or whatever, where we're actually going to create that ticket. And it's usually like an epic with like multiple subtasks that are all scored individually. So yeah, we have yet to see a 20-pointer, and that one 17-pointer was a major aberration.
Yeah, it would be weird to self-assign a 17-pointer without going through leadership.
Yeah.
Next here, question. I really appreciate statement first. I really appreciate your non-goals. Question. How can we prevent people outside of tech writing, in this case management, not to interpret story points in those kinds of ways?
Yeah. I think the number one thing is like just don't divvy it up by writer. Like I started doing that and was just like, this feels weird. Like management's going to get a hold of this. I don't want this out here. This is also a very unhelpful suggestion, but just like have great management. Like thank you, Dutchie. Like we've been given a lot of leeway to kind of like design our own processes and just kind of report back what works and what doesn't. But yeah, I didn't think that, like I said, that could change at any moment. Some people could be out, some new people could be in. You never know what the future holds. But for now, we have some pretty trusting, hands-off management.
That goes a long way when you're not micromanaged on, like we need exactly 6 story points for this item. We've got a couple questions left here in time for that. Does having story point scores help you assign out the variety of work on a weekly basis? So does each person get a mix of small and larger tickets?
That's kind of the intention. We're not quite there yet. I've literally spent so much time on this talk in the last like month or so that like I kind of like stopped the actual implementation of it at actual work. Again, having a great boss that will let you do that really helps. But yeah, like, and I guess on the management thing too, like I said in the talk, like if you're not going to show some willingness to at least kick some ideas around and like try to quantify your work, then you're going to get into this like, well, you got to do something. So you're going to you're t-shirt sizing all your tickets, and we'd have unworkable metrics foisted upon us, as I said. So,
or looking up shells and trying to find all the Fibonacci sequence items that way. This last question that we have time for: would this system work if you're the only writer?
Probably not. I think that moot court exercise, what do they call it? calibration exercise. Like you kind of have to have multiple people like, you know, giving input and like talking this out of like, okay, why did you score this way? Like if it's just your own voice in your head, like I think your scores are gonna get like completely useless. I haven't tried it on my own, and I guess the fact that we're not consistently like going through as a team and scoring them together, like, I don't know, maybe my data is all crap, who knows? But yeah, I think that might be a good idea. That's maybe one thing that I'll take back to the team.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom Edmonds, everyone.
Thank you.